Running Horse Creations presents Eden Symbiotic by Meriah Smith. Read to you by the author. Prologue. The beginning of Eden's history is a strange and tragically violent one. In the beginning, Eden had another name, Zarukrush, which meant New Hope in the language of the Ozbin. Zarukrush was an uninhabited planet, with Earth-like conditions that spun in a solar system much like Earth's own, with 3 moons instead of only 1. The first was a bit smaller than Earth's moon, and the farthest out. The second moon was smaller still, and the third and closest moon was the smallest. They were called the Three Sisters. Even centuries later, after Zarukrush's name was changed to Eden, their name endured. The recorded history of New Hope begins in another distant galaxy when a fleet of colonial ships set sail across the void to their new homeworld. It begins with a hope for peace and freedom from oppression out of reach of an overbearing government. This is a cause familiar to many Terrans, yet these people are not at all human. Their large fleet of spaceships fled their homeworlds nearly 5,000 years ago when they headed off for Zarukrush. The technology they had at their disposal was advanced enough that their courageous leap through the largely uncharted space was completed in a matter of months instead of centuries. The exact details of how Ozbin immigrants established themselves, created a fair working government, and thrived in peace for the next 2,950 years is another tale. The details of how a few mad men and women rose to power and plunged their world into Armageddon doesn't matter for this telling of Eden's beginning. What matters for Eden's beginning is how the war ended. Not in victory, but in total annihilation of every living thing on New Hope. Some military leaders got the bright idea to create the ultimate biological weapon to destroy their enemies once and for all. The best geneticists were gathered, and after 10 years of hard work, they achieved their goal. Inside 50 brood tanks were dozens of worm-like creatures that glowed with their own bioluminescent light. They were made mostly of energy and were out of phase, so they could go anywhere and find anyone. The only thing that kept them in their brood tanks when they finally came to maturity was a sedative injected automatically into the amniotic fluid they floated in. On the day the parasites were to be deployed, their creators' enemies discovered the labs and the activity there. Bombs were dropped, and most of the laboratory complex was destroyed in the initial attack. The brood tanks were deep underground and well protected from the raging inferno above. Yet there was no protection against the total system power failure caused by the bombing. Without the constant supply of sedative being pumped into the tanks, the parasites awoke from their sleep. They phased through the glass of the brood tanks and floated away to hunt and scavenge for anything organic. The underground labs were soon devoid of every living survivor of the bombings. All houseplants, lab animals, and experimental microbes were absorbed by the parasites, every scrap of organic material until nothing was left. Then they phased out of the labs in search of more prey, traveling underground to avoid the inferno that was still raging above. The parasites multiplied prolifically and evolved at an unnaturally rapid pace. All their offspring and all their varieties were voracious eating machines. To escape the plague of monsters that consumed all life and seemed to have no major weaknesses, the Ozbin prepared to evacuate the planet. Many of them managed to flee with the aid of their small fleet of colonial ships, loading with as many people and supplies as the ships could hold. Many more had no hope of escaping the planet's destruction. The old, the sick, and the weak were left behind deliberately. And about 10 million other people had to be left behind regardless of health, for there was no more room on the ships. Those left behind survived for a time by hiding in buildings that were not yet discovered by the hordes of parasites whose numbers were ever growing. They scavenged for ever-dwindling supplies and found ways to filter out their increasingly fouled water. The remaining survivors discovered soon after the evacuation of friends, enemies, and loved ones that fire could be used as a weapon against the parasites. But this only slowed their destructive progress against the remaining people in scattered pockets throughout the planet. The survivors held on for a year as the parasites ravaged the planet. Most died from predation of the parasites, disease, and starvation. Some died in fights over dwindling resources or desperate acts of cannibalism. For many, the cause of death was loss of hope. In despair, they just took their own lives, unable to hold on to the hope that there would be a ship sent back from the old homeworlds to rescue them. The rescue ships never came. At the very end, when nearly all organic matter was consumed and the parasites were now preying on each other and wiping themselves out, about 2,500 people still clung to life planet-wide. These people were the toughest and smartest of all the people that had been left behind. Even so, their existence was hanging by a thread. They were slowly starving to death, and the lack of clean water was taking its toll. Even these hardy souls had become too weak to fight off or run and hide from the last of the parasites. The remaining species of parasite that still survived even after all the other parasites were dead looked like shining stars the size of a human fist. They were beautiful, voracious, deadly, and bordering on becoming self-aware. They rained down on the last remaining people and killed them all in a few days. This tragic ending to one people's hope for peace and freedom is where Zarukrush dies. Yet this is not the end, but the beginning of a shining hope that would successfully create and maintain forever a peaceful and prosperous society from the ashes of a dead world. Parasites went through one final change that caused them to stop evolving at such an unnatural rate. When the last kind of parasite had killed their host, they turned their victims' bodies into a sort of organic life support system in the form of chrysalids. There was no other way for them to survive. It's unknown exactly how long the parasites lay sleeping and metamorphosing in their chrysalids. Centuries later, it was speculated to be about 2 years by modern-day historians and biologists. When they finally emerged from their pupa and instinctively ate the last shreds of the soft tissue inside them, the world was born anew with them. These new creatures looked much like the Ozben, though they were not the same species. They even had the same memories as their dead hosts, which had caused them some confusion in the beginning of their existence as sentient beings. They were humanoid with glowing white skins, hair the color of precious metals adorned their heads, and glowed with hues similar to their hair color. Slanted almond-shaped eyes, large and solid black, a little bigger than human eyes, but not by much. The Ozben were shades of blue-gray and didn't glow. Physically, these new beings, except for the glow and the color change, looked no different, superficially at least. They awoke to a dead world with nothing for them to eat and no clean water for them to drink. Not even the once vast numbers of parasites were still alive to keep them company. They were all dead. Soon, many were praying hard to the old gods for help. Desperate hearts and minds reached out to the heavens. By some miracle or sheer dumb luck, a single female accidentally made mental contact with a young Maasai girl in the middle of the Serengeti plains. She'd been helping to gather food for her family alongside her mother and grandmother. Both the female alien and the young girl were surprised and confused by this odd mode of communication. The Ozben were telepathic, yet they were not strong enough to reach across the vast distances between worlds. Through this psychic connection, the newly sentient being could sense that the girl had food, and the new being was ravenous. Rael Shar had been her host's name, so that's who the sex-female parasite thought she was, in spite of the confusing physical differences in her body. So her dead host's name became absorbed into this shining being, just like the rest of the original Rael Shar. The new Rael Shar yearned with all her might to be on a world so obviously teeming with life and abundant food. This desperate yearning, born of great need and the instinct of self-preservation, forced another power of her kind to come online much sooner than it would have under better circumstances. Teleportation. One moment, Rael Shar was in the middle of a miserable group of men and women of her kind. The next, she arrived on Earth. She appeared in a cry of agony and confused terror next to the group of female humans. The sudden forcing of her power had caused her a rather nasty migraine. Terrified by this white and silver-haired apparition suddenly appearing out of nowhere, the three Maasai ladies fled, dropping their collecting baskets and spilling their contents on the ground in their haste to return to their village. Rael Shar paid them no mind. Nearly blinded by pain, she just curled up into a fetal ball and held her poor head. In time, the pain faded, and she was able to take stock of her surroundings. She saw the various fruits, nuts, tubers, and termites the Maasai ladies had left, and attacked them ravenously. When she was sated, she fell into a deep healing sleep in the tall grasses. She woke a few hours later and remembered the rest of her people. She mentally called out to them and showed them how to teleport. Soon the entire population of 2,500 men and women had arrived in the early 1200s of Earth's calendar time. Legends of the Shining Ones were born that day, and would later be dismissed as fairy tales as centuries passed. Humanity did not welcome them with open arms, and the Shining Ones had a strong aversion to warfare, so these newcomers hid in scattered pockets in remote areas across Africa. As time passed and their powers grew, their hard-won survival became easier. They discovered that not only were they powerful telepaths, they had an unusual amount of control over their ability. They could turn the ability off and on at will, or even control how telepathic they wanted to be, even block out others from their minds. They discovered that they shared a loosely connected collective subconsciousness that they called the dreaming, and they could pass information to each other when they slept. Or by placing the dreaming under conscious control when they were awake, they could link their minds together and act as one collective entity for brief periods. They also learned to create illusions by directed hallucinations of incredible clarity. Next, they discovered their talent for telekinesis, moving objects with increasing ease just by willing them to move. Followed by a small talent for pyrokinesis, which was quickly employed to make campfires. Then the ability to make anything temporarily invisible, including themselves. Healing came next after that, and they could heal any wound or sickness. They also discovered that they were immune to any disease or parasitic infestation, and because of this, they could not be carriers of disease either. Lastly, the shape-shifting of themselves, other living things, and various objects. This ability to shapeshift into animals and humans with ease helped them to hide in plain sight among Earth's host species undetected. This time of growth in their life cycle took about 10 years. Not long after they were able to hide among the humans, it was decided in their own best interest to restore their homeworld. They both had the knowledge and the technology on their world to re-terraform their planet and rebuild their cities. Since the Terran lifeforms were so similar to the now extinct lifeforms on Zarukrosh, and it was readily available, they used Earth's DNA to reestablish a healthy biosphere on their dead planet. Also, they unanimously agreed that they would learn from the dead predecessors' mistakes and not repeat them. Peace would reign once more. They would not fail. During the time of Zarukrosh's healing began, the Shining Ones began to have serious doubts about their being Osbin. True, the Osbanians did have some telepathic ability, but not the rest of their powers. Some stubbornly argued if they were not Osbin, why could they remember their lives on Zarukrosh? The parasites killed the Osbin. We are the parasites. Not possible. Possible! For decades the argument went on unresolved as they labored to fit into Earth's cultures without getting involved in the course of human history, while making a living among humans and restoring their home planet. No human would have discovered the existence of the Shining One's true identity, and the argument of are we Osbin or evolved parasites debate would have remained unresolved if it had not been for Rael Shar and Lai Topin. Rael Shar and Lai Topin were a mated pair, and had been for the past 50 years by then. Having been living among the Cherokee for the last 5 years, they renamed themselves Elois and Amoitoi, pronounced Amoitoi with a short A sound, meaning coming from or originating from water. They had mostly abandoned their old Osbin ways in favor of the Cherokee traditions. Their lives were good, and they had many friends, and none knew that they were not human. Then Eloise became pregnant for the first time, and she was also the first female of her kind to do so. 6 weeks later, she clutched 2 spherical light blue-green eggs the size of pomelo grapefruits. This was something of a shock to the entire Shining One community, as news of this event traveled from mind to mind via the dreaming. The Osbin were mammalian. The Shining Ones, as they discovered, were not. Eloise kept her eggs wrapped in warm furs next to the cooking fire. In the middle of a warm summer night, the eggs hatched while the entire village slept. The hatching larvae resembled their parents just before they metamorphosed into people, beautiful like small bright shining stars the size of a human fist. They floated out of their parents' home and into the neighboring house. There, they phased into the 2 sleeping adults and made themselves at home. The sleeping man and wife were oblivious to the intrusion of their bodies, and the larvae fed on their new host, yet they did no harm to them. Eloise and Amoitoi were shocked to discover their children had hatched and were nowhere to be seen. They used their ability to sense living things and track down their offspring, and their now frightened and confused hosts. Both the man, the woman, and the new parents feared the symbionts would kill their host or at least make them very sick. Yet this did not happen. After much revealing of truth, debate, discussion, deal striking, the new host decided to help the children live so long as they proved to do no serious harm to themselves. Eloise and Amoitoi agreed to remove their offspring if it was asked of them. This proved to be utter serendipity. At first the new host did weaken for a time. Eloise and Amoitoi devoted themselves to looking after them. For the first 6 months, the new hosts were capable of little more than eating and sleeping. Then gradually, towards the end of that 6-month period, their strength returned and they were able to get up and do small tasks to maintain their own household. As the symbionts matured, they bonded with their hosts, not only physically, but mentally as well, making them want to help their hosts as much as they were able. Love sealed the bond between host symbiont and pairs of the symbionts. An odd sort of family unit was created. The symbionts eventually learned that they had the same powers as their parents, only they could not shapeshift themselves, nor did they have quite as high an endurance as their parents. They could shapeshift their host, however. Also, they stopped the aging process and gave their host greatly enhanced strength and endurance. Not as much as some of the Marvel comic superheroes, but enough to fly in avian form, break small steel chains, and bend steel bars up to 1 inch thick. After a time, the symbiotes could phase in and out of their host at will. They could go off in separate directions for up to 12 hours before both host and symbiote began to suffer. The symbiote from lack of food, and the host from the lack of protection from viruses and the presence of the symbiote itself. The host body becomes dependent on the symbiote to survive. The physical bond had become that strong. Also, the symbiote suppresses the host's immune system, so the host body cannot reject the symbiote. And then it shares its own immunity with its host. Results? The host-symbiote pair is as impossible to infect as the adult Shining Ones, so long as they didn't stay apart for too long. The Shining Ones had been watching the progress of the 2 symbiote host pairs with growing hope. They were heartened by the possibility of a coexistence with humans, but hard as they tried to gently reveal themselves and create a peaceful coexistence, most humans still rejected them as monsters, evil spirits, or witches. Very few families welcomed the Shining Ones into their lives so they could help them have children. True, the Shining Ones could have turned evil and taken over Earth easily enough, used humans as host slaves and turned the remaining population as laborers. But the Shining Ones were a product of war themselves, born into full awareness because they possessed the memories of their hosts. This made them already sick of war. They despised violence to the point of near pacifism towards the humans, and especially towards each other. So the solution was to continue to restore Zarukrosh and evacuate Earth as soon as the terraforming was finished. To make sure the situation was not further complicated, a temporary no-breeding clause was passed by the Shining One's ruling council. Then a plan was launched to bioengineer some people or their offspring, and then make enough of them so their people could have the choice of whether or not they wanted to become joined, as they now called it. Even if it meant extinction, the Shining Ones would never force anyone to become a host. This seemed like a straightforward solution, and it was meant to be. Yet life happened, and it's often messy by its very nature. During the next 1,000 years, more and more eggs were laid by mated pairs and small polygamous groups. They did not obey the council's ruling as they should. Early in the first 200 years of the no-breeding clause, sharper measures had to be taken. The eggs were too precious to destroy, and they could not be allowed to hatch in uncontrolled numbers. So the 3 moon-based complexes on the 3 sisters were converted into cryogenic labs to store the eggs indefinitely until more favorable conditions occurred. This practice of controlling the number of eggs that were allowed to hatch at each egg season became a permanent means of not overwhelming Eden's, as the former Zarvacrosh would be called, native population. Eventually the terraforming was finished and the Shining Ones all returned home. With them, they transported their joined ones, their willing family members, and quite a lot of stolen human eggs and sperm. The eggs and sperm had been stolen from various banks and just as often from unknowing donors. In this way, a healthy human and sentient bioengineered population was grown in brood tanks and then raised by the community when they were born. Many centuries passed with Eden growing and prospering undisturbed. Earth and its off-world colonies grew and prospered. Humans met with other alien races, and they were always exploring new territories to study and colonize. Eventually, after many centuries, a starship discovered a Terran-like planet that broadcast through various frequencies via radio, television, computer, and satellite feeds that there was sentient life living there. They thought they may have discovered a lost human colony that had blended with the host species of that planet and likely had forgotten their origins. Lost colonies were rare but not unheard of, and the usual procedure was undertaken to make careful contact and re-establish communications between them and the rest of the human race. Unknown to them, these explorers were being closely monitored by the main council's telepaths after their mothership had been sighted from the cryogenic lab spaces on the outermost moon. They did nothing to stop them, curious to see what the explorers would do. The explorers selected a clearing that was not too far and yet not too close to what would look like a major city in the Western Hemisphere as the landing site. They sent a team of specialists aboard a shuttle to make observations and slowly make contact with the locals that lived in that area.